Welcome, Left Reckoners. David here, joined as always by my good friend and comrade, Matt Leck. How you doing, brother?
I'm doing good, David. Good to be with you.
Yeah, man. And we're really thrilled to be joined by Jodi Dean, someone I've been reading for a very long time, who has this new book out called Capital's Grave, which will be released on March 18th. Jodi, seriously, thank you so much. It's such an honor to speak with you.
I'm so happy to be on your show. Thanks so much.
Well, this is a really interesting book, and I'm really looking forward to sort of jumping into it. I'm going to admit, am one of these people who's very hesitant about, these kind of feudalism comparisons. But I will say, as somebody who does media, I know for a fact, if I put feudalism or serf and lord in a title, right, it is something that really, really speaks to people. And I was just curious, before getting into like all of maybe the definitions and the main argument of the book, I'm just curious why you think calling something like feudalism is so evocative with everyday people. Because in my experience, it seems to be something that really paints a picture that is compelling to folks.
Because people don't feel free. Right? People feel trapped in everything. People feel like everything is being taken from them all the time. So we've gone from a situation where most workers could feel like they were making things, even if they were making for the capitalists, right? Even if they're making them on an assembly line and they don't control their conditions, but they still felt like they were making things. Now, most people feel like no matter what, the primary feature of their lives is stuff is being taken from them all the time. That's feudalism. It feels like feudalism all over again.
Yeah, and I think we can get to the definition in just a second too. I think one thing that is sort of latent in your book too is like people feel like a lack of control in their life, and I think this is actually like one of the main political questions of the time, both on like what we might call like the left, and I mean it's like maybe like the Democratic Party stuff, and like the right is like there's a feeling that like, I'm not in control of my life, and you can see it sort of presents itself in many different forms. But you see that, for example, like something like Brexit, that was something that was very mobilizing for people because they felt like they weren't in control of their life. I'm just curious, if you agree with that assessment.
I think it's really interesting to think about the kinds of lack of control that people feel and have felt and coming from what, right? So as people who are critical of capitalism, we always recognize that one of the conditions that most workers have is that they're not in control of their work life, right? They sell their labor power to a capitalist, but they don't have a lot of control once they enter the factory, right? That's why nobody likes the bosses, because the bosses are the ones that have control. But it seems like these days there's a different kind of lack of control. Some are able, like I think the right is able to translate that general feeling into saying, you don't feel control because the state has control. And so their answer is, what? To try to dissolve parts of the state that actually help us and then strengthen parts of the state that make things worse? Or people have said, well, you don't feel like control because there's a bureaucracy. So then what do we have? We get a zillion different levels of technology where you never ever talk to a person who has any responsibility and can help you out. And you get transferred between this app and this layer and that layer. So again, it's no control. So I think one of the things that's kind of interesting about our current situation that gives it this feudal flavor is a lack of control, but there's also a kind of lack of accountability, a lack of centrality. I talk about this with the, not so elegant term parcelization of sovereignty that I got from Perry Anderson, who's a great Marxist thinker, but it's also in a lot of the writing that people have done on feudalism to talk about how under feudalism power was fragmented. You can just think of little castles and forts and little knights, and everybody's beholden to somebody, but nobody is really on top because even the king is another king that he's fighting with. And so it's all fragmented. It's a really different kind of authority structure than, say, the classic days of the nation state. So so what I would say is that people definitely feel like they're not in control of their lives, but to target the state as the exact location of that isn't really accurate anymore. We've got to change information.
Well, go ahead, Matt.
I
Sorry.
was going to say, one final note on the feudalism metaphor. People listening to the show might be familiar with Yanis Varoufakis' techno-feudalism work. How would you contrast your thesis from his?
Yeah, his work is really important, as is Cedric Durand's, who's also working under the general techno-feudalism sort of vocabulary or heading. And I don't have any strong disagreement with them. The reason I talk about neo-feudalism instead is I want to bring out what happens to the vast majority of people, namely the service sector or the servants or the serfs. And I play fast and loose with that language because I think it captures something to blur it all together. So most of us feel like serfs. Most of us work. I mean, by most of us, I don't mean that like out of the two of the three of us. I mean that the majority of people on the planet work in some kind of services, whether or not it's paid or unpaid, informal, temporary work, domestic labor, or, schmancy kind of consultant work. But the majority of people are in services. And the techno-feudal hypothesis doesn't pay attention to that part. So what I'm trying to do is to bring out the working conditions, work lives for the vast majority of people, and let us see the this kind of feudality of the present in, maybe with a little bit more rigor with respect to class structure and class struggle.
So, I'd like to sort of get into the question of like what a service worker is, because that's one thing that you see a lot of debate on the left about, but maybe to just sort of paint it clearly. I mean, I might just ask you like a couple examples, right? I mean, when we're talking about service work, I think most people can think of like for example, is a barista, is that a service worker? Is transportation service work? I mean, help us understand sort of what we're getting at when we're talking about service workers.
So, a couple of things. It's not just a kind of a blurry thing on the left. It's been blurry since, like, the United States was the first primarily service economy. And that happens in the 1960s. And even at that point, economists and sociologists aren't sure what they want to call, services. And even in the kind of general economic data, all sorts of stuff is thrown into this. So, you might have personal services, consumer services, various kinds of like domestic services, private services. The way I think about it, which I hope is a kind of orthodox Marxist way, is something that's not producing a commodity, that's not objectifying labor objectifying, putting it into an object, but where the labor is consumed at the same time that it's that it's exercised or that it's carried out. So yes, a barista is really doing food services, not making a bunch of things that are later going to be sold. It's a barista, though, that's complicated, right? Like, it starts to move in, but I think transportation is clearly service work, nursing, teaching, all kinds of care work. Those would be like, and then also, financial services, real estate, the kind of higher end things. But teachers, nurses are also really good examples. Doctors, physicians, most people who work in airports. If you think about like baggage handlers, and one of the things once you start doing this is we also see over the last 10 or 15 years, where have been the places where there have been a lot of successful labor organizing and work stoppages and strikes have been, particularly if you look globally, have been across services.
Mm-hmm. So, I mean, I want to there's something I'm going to ask later about how we view these workers in the general like socialist communist strategy. But before we get there, I mean, one of the tensions and things I'd be curious for you to talk about is, I don't need an exact timeline. We don't need to really like go super in depth here. But I mean, the transition, for example, in America to a more quote unquote service-based economy has been like a long-term trend, right? I mean, so is this something that, people just weren't recognizing, in the 70s and 80s, or is there something unique about the 2020s and this era that is meaning that we're more in this kind of neo-feudal, or approaching this neo-feudal paradigm?
I think that's a really smart question. And I haven't thought, I like thinking about it because I didn't answer this exactly in the book. So first thing, I think that people started seeing transformations in labor, already in the mid 20th century, and then you start to see it as the feminization of labor. And at first they're thinking it's just because more women are in the workforce. And so that's part of it. But then they call it pink collar jobs. And then they're starting to see actually more men are in these jobs too. It's also part of the managerial revolution. So that's sort of the initial language. And then I think that and so then we've got, let's say, 40 years of neoliberalism. And the idea that everyone was an entrepreneur was somehow supposed to be, I don't know, put the oomph back in capitalism, and I would maybe say the masculinity back in capitalism. But really what that was doing was kind of revving up a gig economy, making people feel like by making apps and actually doing service, I'm using service sarcastically, but service work for Apple, right? Doing all sorts of work so that people would have a reason to have an iPhone without really getting paid unless, their apps took off, right? They're starting to do a whole lot of different kinds of work that don't fit into regular capitalist, how we've thought about labor in the past. So we had this kind of movement. And then I would say, so you get 40 years of neoliberalism and the 2008 crisis. Now, keep that sort of intertwined trajectory going on at the same time that we keep seeing increased digitalization, because tech guys like Jaron Lanier is one of the first people who uses this lords and serfs of the internet, and he uses this, I think it's like 2006 2007, I don't remember the exact date off the top of my head, but before, what's important to me is before the 2008 financial crisis, this was already a logic that's unfolding in tech, where it's like, what was it? Somebody says, sharing is basically where the rich get more, and we have to share with one another to survive. They're making a profit off of us sharing with one another. So I think that it's taken a while for the kind of realization of, oh, this really is what tech's doing. It's not this entrepreneurial paradise where not everybody's rich. In fact, the power law distribution of inequality is what's really real. 2008 was not some kind of one-off enigma. It's really bad. And then I think I would also add on this, to make one last point, is that the COVID pandemic really brought to our attention our dependence on service work. Whether or not, all of the dying nurses and doctors, the emergency workers, the challenges that teachers face, there was arguments about what should happen with the schools. And then, people's reliance on delivery drivers. So I think these might be, these start to kind of crystallize or maybe come in a Rubik's Cube where it shapes up and it starts to be visible.
Mm. Yeah, no, I mean, we spoke to some of the organizers at the Whole Foods Union in Philadelphia recently, and the COVID crisis was something, that was very politicizing for a lot of folks, not just because of the danger, but also because all of a sudden, we're being told that we're super essential, and yet we feel like we're not being taken care of. So when these kind of shifts in the way that we're seeing, like being a member of maybe the working class in the U.S., where does this kind of create? What is the necessary shift beyond just like maybe having analytical precision if people accept the feudalism thesis? Where is the kind of political weight, behind this strategy? Because I just want to put maybe a kind of historical example to help us get here. Like a lot of the work I do is sort of looking at like the South in like the 1890s to like the 1920s, where you saw this massive socialist movement and these mass movements of tenant farmers, right? A big part of this is like the railroad unions, right? Which, could quote unquote be thought of as like service workers, right? Tenant farmers, right, is one of those things. I mean, this was a big debate in the Socialist Party. Do they count as proletarian? Are they members of the working class? And yet in like practical reality, like the American socialist movement was like very much engaged in those fights. And maybe we've just forgotten and lost our ability to do that kind of thing. But what I'm trying to get at here is that like, Is the understanding of this shift in being a laborer today in America? What is the kind of consequence of that politically in terms of like our action as movements that we should be taking?
Um, I love that question. I also love your earlier phrasing from your talk with the Whole Foods organizers in Philly. Is that they felt essential but not taken care of. Right. That's a really kind of crucial, I think, crystallizing and very political statement that's very, very useful. So I hope at some point we can keep circling, or circle back to that. But for organizing, this is going to sound like another little tangent, but it's not. Or maybe it sort of is. But I co-edited a book with Charisse Burden-Stelly called "Organize, Fight, Win," and it's a collection of the political writings of Black communist women. So, Black women in and around the CP from say 1927 or so to 1956, and they are there's a thematic that goes through their work, which is organizing domestic labor, because the majority of Black women worked outside the home. They worked outside the home because their families depended on it, because their husbands were blocked from jobs or blocked from well-paying jobs. So the kind of male head of household who earned a family wage did not apply to them. And one of the struggles that they had within their parties was to try to get more focus on how do we organize domestic workers? This is not easy, but we need to attend to that. And I think the same thing has been, as you referenced some of the challenges within the parties of like, there needs to be a commitment to organizing tenant workers and sharecroppers. And how do we do that? And how much, investment there's going to be into it. But I think the historical part is really significant because it lets us know that within our tradition, it has never been the case that only guys in factories are the proletariat. That's not what labor is. Labor is bigger. And so now I think it's crucial that we recognize the vast expanse of service work as a class. And the reason for this is actually optimistic. Like I'm trying to think dialectically about neo-feudalism to say, look, okay, in our world now, the majority of workers are in services. What does this mean? It means that as we think about how do we adapt to a warming planet, we can't rely on an always outmoded and inaccurate vision of industrial productivism as the core of socialist and communist organizing, futurity, visions of class relations. In fact, what we can do is recognize that the majority of people are already ushering in styles of work that can be what we need on a warming planet, which is work that takes care of one another and the planet. Right, that we can think of this. We don't have to think of service workers as just carrying the wealthy, like taking care of their needs. If we get rid of the wealthy, then the services we do are for each other and for the planet. So, you can get rid of a whole bunch of, let's say, financial services and create a lot more, say, land reclamation services. You can get rid of the kinds of, like, let's just say transport for the wealthy, and think about transport for the many. You can get rid of things like, personal care for the very elite and extend health care for everyone. And then, of course, this means recognizing the essential nature of this work and that everybody has to be taken care of. So in my view, putting service work at our center could also make us think about a kind of a new synthesis of the working class and a socialist future. And then the demand would be universal basic services, right? Health, education, housing, all of these ways that we serve one another and the planet.
Could you go into a little bit more about universal basic services? Because we're folks who were fairly skeptical. I mean, welcoming of government, checks to people in times of pandemic and stuff like that. But the UBI is sort of the panacea for what's going on with capitalism. Can you just distinguish UBI from UBS?
Yeah, I have never understood why anybody on the left liked UBI. Right? It is just like a neoliberal right-wing way to strip social programs and put money in individuals' pockets so that they immediately put it back in the pockets of the capitalist. Universal basic services doesn't look at or doesn't focus on money in individuals' pockets. It focuses on what do people, communities, land, the species need. And these would be the kinds of services that would be provided with a universal basic services framework. So things like health, education, water, air, the more fundamentals. And I think about this as in combination with like basic commie things like the abolition of private property and making sure you have centralized planning, and you can make it suitably like responsive, bottom up, complicated, and all that. But I think getting rid of this assumption of basic income, but instead think in terms of services also, and universalizing services also lets us see our service workers class as the bearers of a better future, right? They're not just servants, right? In this kind of like, we're serfs who are taking care of the elites. They're actually they're creators of the future. That's what made the working class struggle so powerful in the 19th and 20th centuries. It wasn't like, workers are oppressed and immiserated. It's like workers are collectively strong and are responsible for all of the wealth that's created in the world. It's just not in their hands. And I kind of feel like we've gotten in this framework of only thinking about who's a victim and who's oppressed and who's suffering and not where's the strength. And class struggle was always about class power and building that power. And I think we need to recognize services as a location of this power, both as it provides it and for a demand for it.
I think that's well put, and I think focusing on the strength is a really critical thing. Jodi, I mean, people should definitely pick up the book. There are links for folks to get it. Is there anything else that you might want to note for folks before we let you go here about some of the? I mean, we weren't able to get into like some of the global arguments and things like that. But is there anything else that you would like to sort of tell our audience about the book to sort of tease them on picking it up? Excuse me.
There's some chapters that are really technical, and you might not like them, but still get the book anywhere. You can get that anyway because the first chapter and the last chapter bring out the argument I'm making here. And so if you're not particularly interested in complex questions of temporality in the Marxist tradition, don't worry about it. You can skip it. So that's what I would say.
Well, Jodi, thank you so much for joining us. We really appreciate it.
Oh, it was great. So thank you so much for talking to me about it.